Let's bring in our lead fact checker here at CNN, Daniel Dale. Daniel, Republicans certainly kept you busy over the last 2.5 hours.
Jake, that was a parade of dishonesty. We had false claims, we had misleading claims, we had major strategic omissions, we had up is down revisionist history on the coronavirus and other matters. I think it veered at times into the realm of disinformation, even more than mere dishonesty. And Jake, people say, as you know, they all lie. What about the Democrats? Look, I sat here in the same spot listening closely to the Democratic convention. It just was not like this. I think it's important for us to note when things are not equal, and their 4 nights combined didn't have the quantity of dishonesty of tonight's one Republican night. We need to say when this isn't the same and this isn't the same.
That's right. I mean, you pointed out the times that misstatements or lies were made at the Democratic convention. You're saying they're just a lot more at the Republican convention. Give us some examples of what you saw tonight that needs to be fact-checked, and we understand this is just a small sampling.
This is a sampling. So we had Donald Trump Jr. suggest that Joe Biden described riots as, quote, peaceful protests. In fact, Biden explicitly condemned protest violence and looting. We had Nikki Haley describing Trump, the president, as an opponent of so-called cancel culture. The president has railed against so-called cancel culture, but he's also tried to get dozens of people, entities, companies canceled, including Goodyear just last week, and Macy's and Mexico, and a bunch of other entities in the past. A video had the president claiming that he kept every single promise he made. He certainly kept some, but not even close to all of them. Mexico hasn't paid for the wall. Obamacare isn't repealed. We haven't had 4% economic growth per year. That's just wrong. We had multiple speakers, from Congressman Steve Scalise and Jim Jordan, tout economic records that have been obliterated by the pandemic. They cited the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. Well, we don't have that anymore. We're now at 10.2%, higher than at any time since the Great Recession. We heard a number of accusations about Joe Biden that just aren't true, that he wants to dismantle, defund the police. He's explicitly, repeatedly rejected that idea, that he wants to, quote, abolish the suburbs. This is just nonsense about an anti-segregation rule, that he wants open borders. He certainly wants a loosening of immigration policy, but not completely unrestricted migration. We heard extreme hyperbole. One speaker, Natalie Harp, said that we'd, quote, be lucky if we could see any doctor at all under Joe Biden's healthcare plan. That's just ludicrous. And in what, Jake, I think the biggest revisionist history was the suggestion that Trump, unlike various Democrats, did not downplay the coronavirus pandemic. He's the one who said we'd go from 15 cases to close to 0. He's the one who suggested it would go away with warm weather in April. He's the one who said into March that it was under control. So the suggestion that Democrats were wrong and Trump was right is just unmoored from reality, Jake.
Daniel Dale, first, defend yourself. The charge is you didn't fact-check the Democrats. Why are you fact-checking the Republicans?
I did fact-check the Democrats. I was right here in this very studio watching very closely. I filed a piece on the first 2 nights of the DNC. My colleagues filed a piece on the second 2 nights. But I wasn't on TV, Chris, because the material didn't warrant it. There were a few items where they missed context, maybe that were a bit misleading, but there was not a parade of false claims like we had tonight. This one night of the RNC featured more dishonesty than the entire 4 nights of the DNC. So I think as journalists, we need to say when things are not equal, and frankly, they were not equal here.
What are your big 3?
Big 3 lies from tonight?
Yeah.
Well, I think the biggest thing was the suggestion that, there was a suggestion that Trump is doing well on coronavirus, but also the suggestion that he, unlike Democrats, did not play down the pandemic. Trump played it down for months. He's arguably still playing it down, but he said into March, you know, this was going away, it was under control, it was like a flu, etc. There was extreme hyperbole about Biden, inaccurate hyperbole, that he wants to abolish the suburbs, dismantle, defund the police, even that you will not be able to see any doctor under Joe Biden's healthcare plan. And I'd say the third thing, Chris, is the attempt by some speakers to pretend that the pandemic never happened and never affected the economy. So they'd say things like lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. Well, that was true under Trump at one point, but it's not even close to true anymore. Those records have been obliterated by the pandemic. We're at 10.2% unemployment. So you can tout the record and then say, well, we had some tough times, it's no longer true, but they didn't say that last part.
Mike Shields, how'd you feel about your party?
Good evening. Look, I thought it was a fantastic first night. It was a smashing success. Logistically, it came across well. The diversity of it was incredible. The messaging was incredible. You had real Americans, not Hollywood stars. You had real people, business owners, people who are nurses, people that are in the White House that are heroes. I thought the president was really speaking to the voters that helped him win in 2016, a group of voters that the Democratic convention really didn't speak to last week, and it was a huge contrast with what we saw last week.
Toulouse was interesting. You know, they had the president in a clip there with essential workers. You know, one of the problems for minority communities is that they are disproportionately essential workers, which is one of the reasons they're getting more sick. They didn't have a diversity basis around the president tonight. How did that play for you?
Well, clearly the president was trying to show that he can stand toe-to-toe with Joe Biden. We saw last week all of the various speakers say Joe Biden is a decent man, that he's empathetic, that he reaches out to people. You saw the president trying to show that side of him to the extent that it exists, especially since, you know, the vast majority of Americans have an unfavorable view of the president. They don't think he's honest and trustworthy. They don't think he cares about people like them. They don't think he's an empathetic person. So he tried to play that up, and he tried to also showcase some of the diversity within the Republican Party, which is, you know, as a whole lacking in diversity, especially when you compare it to the Democratic Party. But they took some various candidates for congressional office, some state lawmakers from Georgia, and tried to show that the Republican Party is willing to showcase its diverse voices. It's a sign that President Trump wants to try to compete for some minority voters, but he also wants to compete for a lot of the suburban voters who are, you know, sort of dismayed with the sort of blatant racial offensiveness of this presidency, and they're trying to show that, you know, the president who's, you know, said both people on both sides in Charlottesville were very fine, and the president who told certain Congress members to go back to their country is not a racist. That was sort of the goal of today.
Well, the bigger discussion that they're going to have in this convention and with the country is that, boy, if Biden gets in there, things are going to get scary. And the face of that was the McCloskeys, who, of course, came to America's attention when people broke in down the street on their block, and they came out with weapons. I had Mr. McCloskey on the show with his lawyer right after it happened. Here's a piece of the sound from them at the convention tonight.
What you saw happen to us could just as easily happen to any of you who are watching from quiet neighborhoods around our country. And that's what we want to speak to you about tonight.
That's exactly right. Whether it's the defunding of police, ending cash bail so criminals can be released back out on the streets the same day to riot again, or encouraging anarchy and chaos on our streets, it seems as if the Democrats no longer view the government's job as protecting honest citizens from criminals, but rather protecting criminals from honest citizens. Not a single person in the out-of-control mob you saw at our house was charged with a crime. But you know who was? We were.
Now, I got to say, Mike, when I had him on the show, the whole kerfuffle came up that he and I were supposedly fighting about his. That was BS. I asked him how he felt about Trump making him the face of white resistance to Black Lives Matter, because that's what happened when Trump put the video out there. That's just a matter of fact. And at the time, he was so resistant. Now he's at the convention being exactly that. What's the play here?
Well, first of all, I'm glad the way you set that up, which is that they broke their fence down, because a lot of times the way this is communicated in the media is there just happened to be some protesters walking by and these people came out and pointed guns at them, and that's not what happened.
That is not what happened.
Their property was right, and so they wanted to defend themselves. And I think that they speak to a larger issue in the country, which is the unease that a lot of Americans have when they see the police seeding entire blocks of cities and Democratic politicians too scared to take on those mobs because of they're scared their own party is going to say you're not sensitive enough to what they're talking about. So they back their police off and cede entire neighborhoods to people. So we went from very justifiable protests over the death of George Floyd, which opened up a massive cultural moment in our country that was really necessary. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, it got taken over by the mobs. And people said, wait a minute, this is no longer a peaceful protest. There are people that are just mobs, and the police are just backing off.
But Mike,
and so
you think it's a
there's fear.
You don't think it's a fair
That
characterization?
could happen.
I just want to get this one point. I just want to get this one point straight. Then I got to go. When you say they were taken over by mobs, you don't really believe that any kind of ratio you could come up with in any way equates the mobs with the legitimate protesters, right? You don't really believe that numerically
No, that's not
you
what I'm
had
saying at all.
anything